My mother stole my father's $500,000. Insurance to fund a hidden son? The trial revealed everything. I used to think silence was comforting, that it meant peace. But now, silence feels more like a punishment. Every evening when I come back to my one-bedroom apartment in Chicago, no laughter, no voice waiting for me, just a clock ticking away in the background, reminding me how hollow my life has become. My name is Ethan Harris. I'm 27 years old, and on paper, my life looks stable. I work as a software engineer at a game development company downtown. People tell me I'm lucky to have a job that matches my childhood passion. I used to believe that too, but passion without purpose is nothing. And when you've spent years building your life on lies you never knew existed. Wake up, commute, code until my eyes blur, head back home, heat up leftovers, sleep, repeat, a rhythm so predictable it feels more like surviving than living. I watch colleagues go out with friends, call their parents, laugh about childhood memories. And I sit there smiling politely, pretending I have those same anchors in my life. But I don't, because every memory I once leaned on has been poisoned. Every moment of gratitude I thought I owed my mother has turned into something else entirely. Betrayal. And betrayal doesn't just change your past, it reshapes your entire present. There are nights when I stare out of my window at the glowing Chicago skyline and ask myself the same question over and over. Did my life have to be this small, this lonely, or did someone make sure it turned out this way? I didn't used to think like that. I used to trust. I used to believe. Sacrifices my mother made after my father died was ripped apart in a single afternoon. And that's where my story truly begins. Not with the man I am today, but with the boy I was back then, clinging to the idea that my family was doing its best to survive. That belief carried me through a childhood full of hunger and humiliation. Was learning to live without, someone else was living off what should have been mine. When I think back to my childhood, the first memory that always surfaces is my father's funeral. I was 12, too young to understand the permanence of death, but old enough to see my mother's face that day. Her eyes looked hollow, her hands shook as she clutched mine, and I believed in that moment she had lost everything. I convinced myself that she was the only reason I survived the years that followed. Life after my father's death was nothing but a struggle. At least, that's what I thought. My mother, Karen, worked long shifts, or so she told me. We lived in a small house on the outskirts of Chicago. The roof leaked in winter, the heater rattled in the cold, and there were weeks when dinner was nothing more than toast and watered-down soup. I wore the same pair of shoes until the soles peeled away and my socks bled through. Kids at school laughed at me, called me poor, and I learned to keep my head down. Despite it all, I clung to my passion, a computer, so I could learn coding, but he died before he could keep that promise. Afterward, I begged my mother to help me get one, even a second-hand model. She would shake her head and say, "We couldn't afford luxuries like that." She reminded me constantly of the bills, the debts, the endless costs of survival. I believed her. I had no reason not to. But then there were the contradictions. Just months after telling me we could barely afford groceries, she came home with a brand new handbag that cost more than a month's rent. She explained that it was a gift from a friend. When she left for a week-long trip with those same friends, she told me they had paid her way because she needed a break. I swallowed those explanations, too naive and too desperate to think. Otherwise, looking back, I can still see myself sitting at the kitchen table, watching her count coins for milk one day, and then seeing her arrive with salon-fresh hair the next. My young mind tried to reconcile the two pictures, the struggling widow versus the woman who never seemed to go without when it came to herself. I told myself she deserved it. After all, she had lost her husband, and she was raising me alone. But the cost of those contradictions fell on me. I remember missing a scholarship because I couldn't afford the supplies required for the program. I remember fainting during basketball practice because I hadn't eaten all day. And every time when I asked her why things were so hard, she whispered the same words. "Your father left us with nothing." "I'm doing my best, Ethan. You have to trust me." I did trust her blindly, even when the signs didn't add up. Even when whispers from neighbors hinted that things weren't as they seemed, I defended her. I told myself she was carrying the weight of the world, and if I complained, I'd only make it heavier. For years, I wore poverty like a second skin. I let it define me. believing that this was my family's curse, the hand life had dealt us. What I didn't know then was that it wasn't poverty at all. It was an illusion carefully maintained. Something far darker was taking place. And I would not discover the first cracks in that mask until the day a stranger walked into our living room and asked a question that changed everything. It was an ordinary afternoon in late autumn, the kind of day that should have passed without consequence. I had left work early because I had forgotten a folder I needed for the next morning. The sun was already low, throwing long shadows across the street as I pulled into the driveway of my mother's house. I expected nothing more than the quiet comfort of the living room, maybe the smell of her cooking drifting from the kitchen. What I found instead marked the beginning of everything I thought I knew unraveling. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. Sitting on our sofa was a woman I had never seen before. She looked to be in her 40s, dressed in a neat dark coat, her posture upright, her expression composed. There was no smile of greeting, no polite nod, only a gaze that seemed to measure me from the instant our eyes met. My mother stood near her, and when she turned to see me, her face drained of color. At first, I assumed the woman was just an old friend. My mother had plenty of acquaintances from church or the neighborhood. But the atmosphere in the room told a different story. The air was heavy, charged with something unspoken. My mother's voice was the first to break the silence, sharp and trembling. "What are you doing here, Ethan? Shouldn't you be at work?" Her question wasn't casual. It was defensive, almost panicked, as if my presence had shattered a fragile arrangement. I muttered that I had just come to pick up some papers, but my eyes never left the stranger. She studied me with a calmness that made me uneasy, as though she had expected this exact moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady, low, and deliberate. "Are you Ethan Harris?" The sound of my name from her lips sent a chill down my spine. My mother's voice cut in like a blade. "Don't say another word. Leave this house right now." Her outburst stunned me. I had never heard her speak like that before, furious, almost desperate. She moved quickly, stepping between me and the woman as if she could block out the truth. With her body, my heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea what I was caught in the middle of. But I knew instinctively this was no ordinary visit. The stranger did not flinch. She rose to her feet slowly, her eyes fixed on mine. "Your father left something for you," she said, her words clear and unshaken. "Money that was meant to protect your future. Ask yourself why you never received it." Every syllable landed like a hammer. My mother lunged forward, shouting that the woman was lying, that she was nothing more than a scammer. Her hands trembled as she tried to push the woman toward the door, her voice frantic and wild. But the stranger didn't resist. She simply placed a business card on the table and said calmly, "When you're ready to hear the truth, call me." I barely had time to process before my mother snatched the card away and tore it in half, her breathing ragged. She turned to me, her eyes wide, begging me not to believe a word of it. But no amount of pleading could erase the image of the woman's steady eyes or the weight of her words. I left the house that day with my head spinning, torn between loyalty and suspicion. Thought I could trust, without question, yet the stranger's voice echoed in my mind long after she disappeared. "Your father left something for you," and that was the moment doubt first took root. A doubt that would only grow stronger when fragments of old memories began to surface and point toward something I could no longer ignore. That night, I tried to tell myself the woman's words meant nothing, someone who preyed on grieving families. But when I lay down in my old room, the silence pressed in, and my mind betrayed me. The more I tried to dismiss her, the more old fragments of memory forced their way back into the light. I remembered being 14, the year we suddenly moved from the house where I had spent most of my childhood. Warning, my mother announced it one evening at dinner as if it were nothing more than a routine change. "We can't stay here anymore," she said firmly. "I have found a better place." Her voice had carried no room for discussion. At the time, I was too young to argue. She disappeared often, leaving me alone for hours. When she came back, her face was drawn, her hands shaking slightly as she folded laundry or cooked dinner. At night, I sometimes woke to the muffled sound of phone calls, her voice hushed, tense, broken by long silences. I used to tell myself she was talking to relatives, maybe a friend trying to comfort her. Now, replaying those sounds in my head, They felt like something else entirely, conversations meant to be hidden. Then there was the journal. On moving day, as we were packing boxes, I stumbled upon a cabinet she usually kept locked. Got the better of me. Tucked between stacks of old papers was a small hardcover book, its corners worn with use. I opened it and froze. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, the same figure repeated again and again, 600 each month, carefully marked, each line written with neat precision. For a moment, I thought it was nothing more than a record of expenses, but between two pages, I found a folded slip-in, official notice with a government seal. I didn't understand the language fully, but I remember the words disbursement and beneficiary. Before I could read more, my mother appeared in the doorway. Her eyes locked on the book in my hands, and I saw something flash across her face, a coldness I had never seen before. She rushed forward, snatched the journal from me, and snapped, "Don't ever touch my things again." Her voice was sharp, almost dangerous. I apologized, confused and scared, and from that day on, I buried the memory, convincing myself it was meaningless. But now, years later, the stranger's words had brought it all back with brutal clarity. The $600 a month, the sudden move, the secret phone calls, they weren't random events. They were threads of a hidden truth I had been too blind to see, and once those memories resurfaced, they refused to let go. They circled in my mind the next morning as I drove to work, every turn of the wheel echoing with unanswered questions. For the first time in my life, I wondered if my mother's stories of sacrifice and hardship had been nothing more than a carefully built illusion. Still, doubt alone wasn't enough. I needed proof. I needed answers that couldn't be twisted by anyone's words. And so, almost without realizing it, I found myself steering my car not toward the office, to all these memories, and toward the truth I could no longer avoid. The drive to Milwaukee felt longer than it should have. The highway stretched endlessly, and with every mile, my doubts wrestled against each other. Part of me still wanted to believe my mother, to protect the image I had carried of her for so long. But another part, darker and heavier, whispered that the truth was already waiting for me, carved into documents I had never been allowed to see. By the time I pulled up in front of the brick building with the gold lettering Bennett and Associates, I sat there for several minutes, staring at the door, forcing myself to breathe. Finally, I stepped inside. The reception area smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the kind of sterile calm only law offices seem to hold. I barely had time to introduce myself before the door to the back office opened and the woman from my mother's living room appeared. Laura Bennett. She didn't look surprised. If anything, her expression carried a strange inevitability, as if she had been waiting for me to walk through those doors all along. "I knew you would come," she said quietly, with a faint nod. "You deserve to know the truth." She led me into a small office, its shelves lined with files and binders. A folder sat neatly on her desk. When she slid it toward me, my throat went dry. Before I even opened it, that my life was about to change. Inside were records cold, precise, undeniable. The first was the life insurance policy in my father's name. The sole beneficiary, my mother's name appeared to, but only as custodian until I reached adulthood. Every penny should have been mine, but the payout had been claimed in full years ago. The signature at the bottom of the form was my mother's. My chest tightened. As I turned to the next set of documents, bank statements, month after month of deposits, each for $600. A trust fund my father had built from his military pay meant to cover my schooling and basic needs until I could support myself. Nearly 12 years of steady payments, over $80,000 in total, and every withdrawal bore the same name, my mother's. Laura's voice cut through the haze as I stared at the papers. "Your father wanted you to have security. He knew life was uncertain, and he wanted to leave you a future." She pulled out one last page, a letter written in my father's handwriting. The words blurred as tears burned in my eyes, but I forced myself to read. "Ethan deserves stability. Let this fund give him what I cannot. If something happens to me, my hands." Shook so violently the page nearly slipped from my grip. All the nights I had gone hungry, all the scholarships I had lost because I couldn't afford basic supplies, every humiliation I endured had all been avoidable. The money had been there, set aside for me, but it had been stolen before it ever reached my hands. I sat in silence, numb, while Laura watched me with steady eyes. "I know this is difficult," she said, "but you have to decide what to do with this knowledge. You can confront her, or you can let it go. But either way, you now know the truth." Difficult didn't even begin to cover it. It felt like the foundation of my life had been pulled out from under me, replaced by a chasm of betrayal I could never climb out of. For years, I had built my identity on the belief that my mother had sacrificed everything. Story one I couldn't unsee. When I left the office, the folder clutched in my arms felt heavier than any weight I had ever carried. Outside, the Milwaukee air was sharp and cold, biting at my skin. I walked to my car in a daze, my thoughts spinning out of control. Was no longer any doubt. My childhood of poverty had not been fate. It had been engineered. And the person who engineered it was the very woman I trusted most. I drove back toward Chicago, with one single thought burning in my mind. I had to confront her. I had to look my mother in the eye and ask the question that had begun to tear me apart. Why? By the time I pulled into the driveway, my pulse was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The folder sat on the passenger seat, thick with the weight of betrayal. I stared at it for a long time before grabbing it, stepping out of the car and walking up the familiar path to the front door. This was the same door I had walked through 1,000 times as a child, but tonight it felt like a gate into hostile territory. Inside, the house was warm and bright. My mother sat in the living room, laughing on a video call with her friends. For a moment, it almost looked like the picture of a normal evening. But when she saw me standing there, the color drained from her face. Her laughter cut off mid-sentence, and her hands faltered as she tried to end the call. She failed. The screen still glowed with the faces of her friends watching silently. Sensing something was wrong, I stepped forward and dropped the folder onto the coffee table. The sound of it hitting the wood was louder than it should have been, like the crack of a gavel in a courtroom. My voice was unsteady, but it carried more anger than I had ever felt in my life. "Why did you hide this from me?" Her eyes flicked down at the folder, then back at me. For a moment, she didn't speak, her lips trembling. When she finally opened the folder, the truth stared back at her signatures. Bank statements, the insurance policy, my father's letter. There was no denying it, yet she tried anyway. "I used it for us," she said, her tone flat, mechanical. "Everything I did for you." The words snapped something inside me. For me, my voice rose, breaking under the weight of years of suppressed rage. I lost scholarships because we couldn't afford supplies. I fainted during practice because we couldn't buy food. I worked double shifts just to keep us afloat, while every month you were draining money Dad left for me, and you dare say it was for me. Her face twisted, caught between guilt and defiance. "You don't understand," she shouted back. "You were a child. You couldn't handle that kind of money. I did what I thought was best." The argument might have gone on forever, if not for the voices that suddenly broke in from her still active video call. Her friends, thinking they were muted, spoke without restraint. "I told you he'd find out eventually," one voice sneered. "That money was never going to stay buried." Another chimed in, sharper, almost mocking. "All that cash you funneled into your brother's schemes, what did you expect? You thought you could hide it from your own son forever." The words landed like knives. My body went cold. My mother's face turned to stone, her hands shaking violently as she fumbled for the phone. She hurled it against the tile floor, the screen shattering into pieces. But it was too late. The truth had spilled out, raw and undeniable. I stood there shaking, every nerve in my body burning. "So that's it," I said hoarsely. "Dad's money went to Uncle Brian, to some pathetic investment scam. You let me suffer for years while you threw away everything he left for me." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not the tears of remorse. They were tears of being caught, of losing control. "You don't know what it's like," she sobbed. "I did what I had to. I had no choice, but I knew that was a lie." She had choices, plenty of them, and every choice she made carved deeper scars into my life. I turned away, my whole body trembling. For the first time in my life, I felt no warmth in that house, no safety, no family, only ruin. Behind me, her voice rose again, shrill, desperate, almost feral. "You're really going to abandon your own mother? After everything I've done? For you?" I stopped at the doorway, my hand gripping the frame, and forced myself to speak. My words came out raw, half a whisper, half a scream. You'll answer for what you've done. To me, to Dad, to the family you destroyed. Her cries followed me as I stepped outside into the cold night air, but those cries no longer sounded like a mother's love. They were the cries of someone, cornered, stripped of lies, and terrified of what was coming next. And I knew what had to come next. She wasn't going to admit the truth on her own. If I wanted justice, I needed more than anger. I needed the law. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, the folder flashed in my mind like a crime scene photograph. My mother's face, the panic in her voice, the truth spilling out from her friend's careless words, it all circled in my head like a storm without an end. I stayed in my room, the door shut, the air heavy. The silence was broken only by the sound of her footsteps pacing in the hallway. She never came in, but I could feel her presence just outside, waiting, listening. Around midnight, I found a note slid under my door. Ethan, please don't let outsiders destroy us. You are all I have. Don't take this away from me. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words carried the same message I had heard all my life. Guilt, obligation, manipulation. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't admitting anything. She was asking me to bury it, to stay silent, to carry her secret. A few hours later, I crept out to get water. The house was dark except for a faint glow from the living room. I followed it quietly, and what I saw made my stomach tighten. My mother sat hunched over the coffee table, feeding documents into a shredder. Pages vanished one after another, the sound harsh and grating in the still night. I froze in the doorway, watching her. It wasn't grief driving her. It was fear. She wasn't a mother trying to protect her son. She was a suspect trying to cover her tracks. I stepped forward, my voice cold. "What are you doing?" She jumped, her hands shaking, a page half crumpled. In her fist? "Nothing," she stammered. "Just cleaning up old files. They don't matter anymore." But they did matter. They mattered more than anything. And in that moment, I knew she was beyond saving. She would destroy every scrap of evidence if I let her. I took the paper from her hands and saw what she had tried to destroy. A bank statement with my father's trust account number printed at the top. Proof. Proof that she had stolen everything when our eyes met. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, almost too soft to hear, "If you love me, you'll let this go." Those words cut deeper than any scream could have. She wasn't asking for love. She was demanding my silence, my complicity. And I realized then that love had never been enough for her. What she wanted was control. I walked back to my room with the shredded fragments still echoing in my ears. There was no doubt left in me now. She would never tell me the truth willingly. If I wanted justice, I would have to drag it out of the shadows myself. By the time dawn broke, I had already made my decision. This wasn't just between me and my mother anymore. It was between truth and lies, justice and betrayal. And I was done being the quiet son who let everything pass in silence. The next step would be the hardest of my life, taking my own mother to court the morning after the shredding. I packed a small bag and left the house without saying a word. My mother was in the kitchen, humming faintly as if nothing had happened, as if the night before was just a dream. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove straight to the office, not to work, but to find Laura. When I walked into her firm, my face pale and my hands still shaking, she didn't ask unnecessary questions. She simply pulled out a blank form and said, "Are you ready to move forward?" Filing the lawsuit felt like signing away the last thread of family I had left. My hand trembled as I scrawled my name across the papers, but with each stroke of the pen, a strange clarity settled in. I wasn't just a son anymore. I was a plaintiff. And my mother was no longer just my mother. She was the defendant. The news spread faster than I expected. Within days, phone calls began flooding in. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who had never once cared whether I had food on the table, now demanded answers. Some shouted, calling me ungrateful, heartless. "How can you drag your own mother into court?" one uncle barked through the phone. Others mocked me, suggesting I was just after money, that I had been poisoned by outsiders. But the worst came from those who pretended to sympathize. They would lower their voices and sigh, telling me they understood my anger, but that family should never be exposed to public shame. They wanted me to swallow it, to bury it, to pretend the betrayal had never happened. The pressure was relentless. I started receiving messages at work, slipped into my mailbox, even left on my car windshield. Blood is thicker than water. One note read in uneven handwriting. Another was harsher. You'll regret this when she's gone. Every word dug into me, but none of it changed the truth. They hadn't lived through the years of hunger. They hadn't watched the woman they trusted tear up evidence in the middle of the night. They hadn't read their father's letter, promising a future that never came. I stayed with a colleague during those weeks, a man who once lent me money when I couldn't cover my own bills. He gave me a couch to sleep on and told me plainly, "You're doing what your father would have wanted. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His words steadied me when the rest of the world seemed determined to drag me down. Meanwhile, my mother stayed silent. No apologies, no explanations. Just silence that felt heavier than any curse, and in that silence, I knew she was preparing her defense, weaving new lies to take into the courtroom. Every night, as I stared at the ceiling of my friend's apartment, I wondered what the trial would reveal. I thought I already knew the full extent of her betrayal, but a part of me feared there were still truths waiting in the dark. Truths I hadn't yet uncovered. I didn't have to wait long, because when the trial finally began, the courtroom became the stage for a revelation that would tear apart whatever illusions I had left about my family. The courthouse in Cook County looked like every other government building I had ever seen: gray stone, tall columns, an air of cold authority. But when I stepped through those doors, I felt like I was walking into a place where my entire life would be put on trial. Not just my mother's choices, but my childhood, my loyalty, and every ounce of trust I had once carried. The hearing room was crowded. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens scratching, their cameras ready. Family members sat scattered through the benches, whispering in tight circles. I could feel their eyes on me, heavy with judgment. To them, I wasn't just a son seeking justice. I was the traitor who had dared to drag his own mother into the light. When my mother entered, she looked smaller than I remembered. She wore a dark suit, her hair pinned neatly, her face pale but composed. For a brief second, I almost saw the woman who raised me. Then I remembered the shredded papers, the lies, the missing money, and my jaw tightened. She avoided my eyes. As she sat across the room, flanked by her attorney, the judge called us to order. Laura stood tall beside me, her voice steady as she began presenting the case. Bank statements were projected onto the screen. Month after month of deposits, $600 each, traced directly into my mother's account, withdrawals marked in her handwriting. The life insurance policy followed, my father's name, in bold at the top, mine listed as the beneficiary, and below it, her signature, the proof that she had taken it all. The room was silent, except for the shuffle of papers. Each piece of evidence was a dagger, cutting through the image of sacrifice she had built for years. Still, she didn't flinch. She sat with her chin raised, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, like someone bracing for a storm. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. Laura introduced a new witness, and when the doors opened, a young man walked in. He couldn't have been more than 19, with the same sharp jawline I saw in the mirror every morning. His name was Jacob Harris. The judge asked him to sit, and the air in the courtroom shifted. My chest tightened as Laura explained that Jacob was not just another witness. He was my mother's other son. Whispers rippled through the benches. Stared, stunned, as Jacob sat down, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. My thoughts spun wildly, grasping for answers that refused to come. Another son, another family. DNA results were entered into the record. The match was clear. Karen Harris was the biological mother of both Ethan Harris and Jacob Harris. The trust fund money, those years of monthly payments meant for me, had been diverted into Jacob's care. The judge's voice was firm. "Mrs. Harris, do you deny that these funds were transferred to support your second child?" For the first time that day, my mother broke. Tears streamed down her face as she rose from her seat, her voice cracking. Into the silence. "He is my son too," she cried. "I only wanted him to have as much as Ethan. I had to protect him." Her words echoed through the courtroom, but they carried no weight. They didn't erase the years of hardship I had endured, or the truth, that she had chosen to raise one child in secret by stealing from the other. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the bench until my knuckles turned white. Every doubt, every suspicion I had carried now stood in front of me as undeniable fact. My family had been divided in two, the son left to starve, and the son raised in the shadows with stolen money. The judge called for order, but the chaos and my mind was louder than anything in that room. This wasn't just theft, it was betrayal at its deepest level. It wasn't only my future she had stolen. It was my identity, my place in the family, my right to know the truth. When the gavel finally struck, I realized the trial wasn't just exposing her lies, it was dismantling everything I thought I knew about who I was. And the revelations were not over yet, because when Jacob opened his mouth to speak, the weight of another truth was about to fall on me. The judge called Jacob to the stand, and the entire room shifted with anticipation. He moved slowly, his shoulders stiff, his eyes cast downward as though the floor might swallow him whole. I studied him with a mix of disbelief and anger. He looked too much like me for comfort. The resemblance was faint but undeniable. A shadow of my own features reflected in his face. He sat down, his hands gripping the edges of the witness chair. When the clerk asked him to state his name, his voice cracked slightly. "Jacob Harris," he said, almost as if he wasn't sure of it himself. For a long moment, silence filled the courtroom. Then Laura stepped forward, her voice calm but pointed. "Jacob, can you tell us when you first learned that Karen Harris was your mother?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I always knew her as someone close," he admitted, "but she never told me the truth until last year. She said she was just a family friend helping me out. She paid for my rent, for my food, sometimes for school supplies. I thought she was just generous. It wasn't until recently that she admitted she was my mother." Gasps rippled across the room. My chest tightened. My mother had lied to both of us, raising one child in secrecy while letting the other believe he was alone. Laura pressed further. "Did she ever tell you where the money came from?" Jacob shook his head. "No, I thought it was hers. I never questioned it, but then I started noticing things in envelopes she didn't want me to see. Bank slips she tore up. When I asked, she told me it was none of my business. I didn't push her. I thought she had her reasons." Then he turned his head, for the first time meeting my eyes. His stare wasn't defiant. It wasn't smug. It was heavy with guilt. "I didn't know the money was meant for you," he said, his voice breaking. "If I had known, I never would have taken it. I never wanted to steal your life." My jaw clenched, my fists tightening on my knees. 100 emotions collided inside me: rage, pity, disbelief. I wanted to shout at him, to ask how he could live all those years without wondering why our lives were so different. But part of me saw the boy he was, another pawn in my mother's deception, another victim of her choices. The judge leaned forward. "Jacob, when you learned the truth, what did you do?" His shoulders sagged. I confronted her. I asked why she lied. She told me she couldn't risk losing both of us, that she had to choose, and she chose me. The words cut through me like glass. She chose me. No, she chose him. She chose to feed him while I starved, to lift him up while I fell behind. The betrayal wasn't just financial anymore. It was personal. It was deliberate. The courtroom grew silent again. My mother sat at the defense table, her face streaked with tears, shaking her head as if to deny it. But the damage was done. The image she had fought so hard to protect was crumbling piece by piece, now torn apart, not by lawyers, not by bank records, but by her own hidden son. Jacob's final words echoed long after he stepped down from the stand. "I'm sorry, Ethan, for everything. You didn't deserve any of this." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat burned, my vision blurred, and for the first time since the trial began, I felt the full weight of what this case truly was. It wasn't just me versus my mother anymore. It was me versus the family she had built in the shadows. And as the judge called for the next phase of testimony, I knew the moment of judgment was drawing closer. What had started as suspicion in a living room was now reaching its breaking point in front of the law. The final day of the trial arrived with an air of inevitability. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my body stiff, my nerves raw. Weeks of testimony, documents, and revelations had brought us to this moment. All that remained was the judgment. The judge entered, his robe sweeping as he took his seat. The murmurs in the room quieted to a hush. Every eye turned forward, waiting for the words that would decide not only the case, but the last remnants of what I once called family. The judge's voice was steady, deliberate. This court has reviewed the evidence presented regarding the disbursement of military life insurance and the monthly trust fund established by Michael Harris for the benefit of his son, Ethan Harris. He paused, glancing at the documents. Stacked in front of him, it is clear beyond dispute that these funds were diverted by Karen Harris for purposes outside of their intended use. Each word hit like a hammer. My hands tightened on the edge of the bench as the ruling continued. The insurance payout of $450,000 was received in full by Karen Harris, though legally designated for the benefit of Ethan Harris. Furthermore, records show consistent monthly withdrawals from the trust fund amounting to over $80,000, also misappropriated. These actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and unlawful appropriation. The room was silent except for the scribbling of reporters' pens. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The court orders Karen Harris to repay the trust funds in full with interest. Regarding the insurance payout, recovery may be limited due to the funds having been transferred to third parties. Nonetheless, Karen Harris is hereby held liable for the misuse of all assets designated for Ethan Harris. In addition, she shall bear the legal costs of these proceedings. The gavel struck. The sound was sharp, final like the sealing of a tomb. On paper, I had one, but the weight in my chest felt nothing like victory. I turned my head toward my mother. For a long moment, she sat frozen, her face pale, her lips parted in disbelief. Then it began. At first, a low mutter, her head shaking as if trying to undo the words she had just heard. No, this isn't right. Her voice grew louder, shriller, rising until it pierced through the courtroom. You ungrateful child, she screamed, lurching to her feet. Her attorney tried to steady her, but she shoved him away. I gave you everything. I sacrificed my life for you, and this is how you repay me. Her eyes burned as they locked on mine, wild and frantic. You think you've won. You'll regret this, Ethan. You'll regret it every single day. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge's gavel struck again, calling for order, but her voice overpowered everything. She was no longer the calm, composed widow who had fooled the world for years. Unmasked, unraveling, stripped of her lies, tears streamed down her face, though they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fury, of a woman who had lost her grip on control. She pointed at Jacob, her other son, her voice breaking into sobs. I did this for you. I only wanted you to have what Ethan had. Why don't you understand? Why don't any of you understand? Jacob's eyes dropped to the floor. He said nothing. The silence of his rejection crushed her more than any verdict could. Her breakdown continued until security gently escorted her from the courtroom, her cries echoing down the hall like a haunting refrain. The sound followed me as I gathered my papers, each scream embedding itself in my memory. I sat there for a moment longer, numb, staring at the empty chair where she had just sat. I had fought for justice, and the law had spoken. But as the room emptied, I realized something painful. A courtroom can deliver judgment, but it cannot give back what was stolen. And as I stepped outside into the cold, Chicago air, I knew the story wasn't over, because beyond the verdict lay the aftermath, the long shadow of what happens when justice is won but family is lost forever. 2 years have passed since the verdict, yet the echoes of that courtroom still follow me everywhere I go. On the surface, life has settled into something steady. I live in a small apartment downtown, surrounded by the noise of Chicago streets, but inside, the quiet lingers. It is the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, that unsettles. The court's order remains in place. Each month, a payment arrives. In my account, a thin stream meant to replace the river that was stolen. But it never comes from my mother. It comes from Jacob. He works 2 part-time jobs while studying, and somehow he insists on sending me the money. At first, I tried to refuse, but Laura told me not to. She said it wasn't just about money. It was Jacob's way of carrying the weight of the truth, his way of saying he never asked to be built from the ruin of my life. As for my mother, Haven't seen her since the trial. I don't know if she lives in the same house, if she speaks to the same friends, or if she spends her nights haunted by what she did. I've cut off every thread. In my mind, she is frozen in that courtroom, screaming, pleading, unraveling for all to see. That image is the last I allow myself to remember of her. Uncle Brian, the man who drained the insurance money, never lived long enough to face judgment. He ended his life quietly, leaving nothing but debts and whispers of failed schemes. His death left no closure, only another layer of bitterness. Another reminder of how much was lost without return, and yet not everything was destroyed. Laura remained. Even after the case closed, she checked on me, reminding me I wasn't entirely alone. Sometimes, when I drive north to Milwaukee, we share coffee and talk about ordinary things. And in those moments, I feel like I still have a piece of family left, just not the one I was born into. But the truth is, victory in court never erased the scars. I still remember the hunger, the humiliation, the scholarships lost. The payments that arrive each month do nothing to restore the childhood I was denied. They cannot return the nights I lay awake listening to my mother's lies. If I've learned anything, it is this: justice can punish, but it cannot heal. Money can be stolen, lost, even repaid, but trust once broken never comes back. And when the person who betrays you is the one who gave you life, the wound never fully closes. I live differently now. I don't ask much of anyone. I keep my circle small. I work, I write, I try to move forward. But there are nights when the city goes quiet, that I look out the window and ask myself the same question I asked when this began. Was I right? Did I fight for justice, or did I lose something far greater in the process? And maybe that's why I tell this story now. Not for sympathy, not for pity, but as a warning, to remind you that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who can tear your life apart the deepest. Because my story didn't end with a gavel. It ended with a lesson carved into me so sharply, I will never forget it. In the end, I won a legal battle, but I lost something far more precious: the trust I once had in my own mother. Justice gave me answers, but it could never give me back the childhood I was robbed of, and that's the truth I live with every single day. If this story struck a chord with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have done the same if you were in my place? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more stories like this to light.